So, ladies and gentlemen, hi, good afternoon. Welcome to this first session of this afternoon on the Tallinn Manual. My name is Marko Milanovic. I'm a professor at International University of Nottingham and one of the co-general editors of the Tallinn Manual, and I will be moderating this conversation with my three distinguished co-panelists. So with me on the stage are Mike Schmitt, professor at the University of Reading and director of the Tallinn Manual project since its inception. Johanna Weaver, who is the director of a fancy center at ANU and was previously a high-ranking Australian diplomat on all things cyber. And Paul Ducheine, who's a brigadier with the Army Legal Services in the Netherlands and a professor at the Dutch Defense Academy. And what we're going to be doing here is really an informal, free-flowing conversation. This will not be a sort of succession of presentations. We want to make it a nice, interesting, interactive chat. And we intend to sort of do that for 45 minutes or so, and then to open the floor to questions from all of you guys. So let's start off. Mike, so my first question is sort of directed to you. And it's basically this. So we had Tallinn 1.0, which was all about IHL and cyber. We had Tallinn 2.0, which is about the rest of international law and cyber. So why bother with Tallinn 3.0?
This is a question that I continue to ask myself, Marko. So the reason 3.0 came is because the environment of cyber has changed dramatically since Tallinn 2.0. When we did Tallinn 1, which was really focused on use of force, ad bellum issues, and IHL, we finished that, and the CCD COE came forward and said, hey, what do you guys want to do next? That was good. Let's do something together. And then the decision was, well, let's just keep going. Because on a day-to-day basis, states aren't involved in the use of force in cyberspace. They're involved in the sorts of things you read about in the newspaper all the time. And so let's start looking at sovereignty and human rights and non-intervention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and add it to the work that had already been done in IHL and use of force. But when we finished that project in 2017, or as we were doing the project, Marko, in 2013 to 2017, states were pretty much silent on the issue of how international law applies in cyberspace. But that's changed pretty dramatically. So now we have, starting, well, a number of countries before that in a smaller way. But for example, the very noteworthy statement by the British Attorney General at Chatham House in 2018. And then the Dutch send over to, from the MFA to Parliament, their position. And it's pretty granular. It's pretty sophisticated. Other states do the same. And then most recently with the 2021 GG, now we have 15 statements by states. Additionally, we have the work that Johanna can talk about in the UN GGE. We had a 2013-2015. Now we have a statement in 2021. And then there's the work of the open-ended working group. So my view of international law is that although academics can opine on what they think the law is, at the end of the day, international law is made by states and only states. International law is authoritatively interpreted by states and only states. So now states are speaking. So we thought it would be good to take the manual and fold in what we're getting from states, now that states have started to think through the issue. Moreover, back in 2017, there was very little scholarship. And now there's lots of scholarship. We launched a book yesterday on a topic that I never really had thought about. Human rights, privacy, armed conflict. Never really occurred to me to think about that. So we now have mountains of scholarship, some of it terrible, and some of it really, really, really first rate. Some of it first rate, like that book. So we need to... The book is on the second half, okay? It was a great book. So now we have the thoughts of a lot of scholars. So we thought the we would take the opportunity to bring it up to speed because we know it's used by legal operators. I mean, this is not some historical book. This is people are actually using the book. So we need to ensure that it remains current. And then finally, Marko, as you and I have talked about it, Marko and I are co-general editors along with a brilliant Estonian attorney, Liis Vihul. And we're supported, by the way, by Liisi Anderson, who's our project manager who at the CDC. She's somewhere in the audience. I can't see her back there. So, we in our discussions, we kind of understand that there may be some subjects that we need to look into that we had not looked into before. So Marko and I had a meeting yesterday. We were talking about this, things like intellectual property. When we travel around, we get lots of questions about intellectual property, international criminal law. We dealt with that in a couple of rules, but we think it merits more treatment. Environmental law. Marko took on the project of thinking about environmental law in the cyber context. We'll probably have a chapter on environmental law. And then finally, a subject which I don't know the first thing about, but is apparently very important, international investment law and cyber. So we'll be adding those new chapters into the project. So keeping it current and adding material that we thought is important, both from the perspective of what states say and new subjects.
Thanks for explaining to me why I'm working with you.
You're working with me because we're fun together. That's why you're working with me.
It's good to know. Yeah. But so it's interesting the way you put it, that states and only states end up making international law when that's obviously not true.
No, I think you're completely wrong. And you're off the team.
In the end, it's actually projects like these make a tremendous impact. And the question is, how do they get to make that impact? And this is not the first or unique such project, in the history of international law. I mean, you will all remember how historically the Institute of International Law, was adopting all sorts of resolutions and so on that had huge impact. And way before that, we go back to the age of Grotius, where, Prussian kings carried a pocket edition of the Law of War and Peace, and, adjusted their behavior to it. So one major theme that we want to explore in this conversation is how a project like this becomes either a success or a failure, and what determines success or failure. So that brings me to people who actually matter, and that's states.
This is my point.
And that's states.
Actually, by that definition, I no longer matter because I am no longer working for a state. So, I might as well just finish talking now.
Yeah. but that would not be fun. So tell us, Johanna, you have participated in every single, basically, negotiation that has existed, within the UN, whether through the GEG or the open-ended working group or whatever. And you could tell from the inside, to what extent the Tallinn Manual had an impact on these negotiations, on what states thought, on the views and positions that states had. So what is your impression of, whether the manual has been successful under some benchmark, influential under some benchmark, and why?
Sure. So I think the first thing I would say is the Tallinn Manual has absolutely been influential. But I don't necessarily think it has been hugely influential in the negotiations. And that is a reflection not of the Tallinn Manual, but of the negotiations. And that is because the negotiations themselves generally don't get into the level of depth that the Tallinn Manual does, right? So the first session of the last GGE, we had 25 experts gathered around the table. We were I forget if we were in Geneva or New York. I think we were in Geneva. And 3 of the new experts came with the Tallinn Manual on the table. They brought it with them and sat it down. So the green book is sitting on the table. And the conversations start, and the experts have differing levels of experience in engaging in the GGE. So you have people like Michel Markov, the US representative, and Andrei Krutsky, the Russian representative, who have been doing this since 1998, right? So not only do they have a very fairly intimate relationship between each other, like Krutsky, for example. Krutsky, for example, has proposed marriage to Michel multiple times, including in GGE sessions.
Peace in the world.
Yeah,
this is what
exactly,
this is.
exactly. So you have, these two love them, hate them, doyens of the process. And then you have people like me, who I was an observer in the 2007, or an advisor in the 2007 process, and then became an expert in this process. And then you have absolute newbies. And of the newbies at the table, sometimes they're diplomats, and sometimes they come from cyber agencies, and sometimes they're lawyers. So you have really quite a diversity of people at the table. And it's a very interesting psychological experiment to watch people and the group dynamics that happens in that kind of negotiation with 25 people, essentially having a conversation backwards and forwards. And the presumption at the start is that you are going to get right down into the depth. Like, let's talk about the technicalities of state sovereignty and, does how do countermeasures apply and all of these concepts. But actually, very quickly, it becomes a conversation about, are we going to be able to progress one or two sentences on insert X principle of international law? And that doesn't need the Tallinn manual. It becomes a diplomatic negotiation exercise. But the reason that I say that it's so influential is A, because the experts bring it and sit it on the table. But B, when we went into lockdown, we suddenly had an insight into people's workspaces, right? So we were doing negotiations. So the GGE sessions were running 6 hours a day, and you would sit, and not always the conversation is interesting. So you're looking at people's backgrounds and seeing what people have, and it's quite notable how many people have their bookshelves behind them and how many experts had the Tallinn manual on the bookshelf sitting behind them. The other area where it's very clearly influential is, Mike, you mentioned the national statements on international law. And I guarantee you, every lawyer that prepared that statement will have consulted the Tallinn manual in preparing the statement. Now, states have differing views about whether they agree with the content, but it is the go-to resource in terms of formulating positions and informing people about what the differing positions are. And I think the idea of updating it to incorporate what has been said about states' views is a great idea and something that is very much needed. The final thing that I would say is there's a strange hesitancy, I think, sometimes to acknowledge among states how influential the Tallinn manual is, because they don't necessarily like to acknowledge that something that comes from outside of states is so influential. And I find that interesting, but it's certainly through my experience and the engagement that I've had with lawyers from many, many different countries. It is something that people consult, particularly countries that are new to the debate.
Thank you so much, Johanna. So this whole idea of state ownership or rejection of a project like this, some kind of foreign entity, is, I think, a major theme. And when you look at other sort of big codification or progressive development efforts, within the international legal system, the International Law Commission is probably the main vehicle for such development. But its procedures are designed precisely in such a way to get state buy-in.
Exactly.
Yet even there's only one article on state responsibility that everybody routinely cites. 90% of ILC work product with, did you really, read the transboundary, water, whatever thingy, So it's really, it's variable. And again, the question is, how does one achieve success or failure? But that brings me to Paul. So Paul, your experience is, of course, from a different kind of state standpoint, right? So not within the negotiations, but within actually operationally doing things or advising the military on what can and cannot be done. So how would you assess the utility of the manual from that standpoint? Do military operators find it useful? Do they rely on it? Do they think it's authoritative? In your experience.
Mike is arresting me already.
Stop the eyeballing.
Or I would say the utility comes from various strands. From a Dutch perspective, and you already mentioned it, the Grotius, and the Dutch have quite a long tradition promoting international law, or writing it or even violating it, by the way. I guess so. Should I have made a waiver?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So we have this long tradition. So I guess the utility finds its place over there as well. The Dutch constitution, I was told it's the only one in the world where the sovereign has ordered the government to promote international law. It's Article 90 in our constitution. And that means that could be a very that could be a legal explanation why the Dutch have supported the writing and the dissemination of the Tallinn manual. But the more logical explanation is that we've always been involved in international law. Think of Grotius, think of the International Court of Justice that is based in The Hague, think of the tribunals. So that the utility finds itself on a political, strategic, legal level in that respect. Going down to the utility for the Netherlands itself, I would say there's various strands. One of them being the political, strategic level, finding its utility by having it applied in promulgating a integrated response framework, how to respond to cyber incidents, cyber attacks, whether criminal or espionage or whatever motive is behind it. And whilst developing that framework, the manual has been used. It was also used when the Netherlands issued their statement on the applicability of the manual, or actually on international law and cyberspace. They intensively checked what was in the manual and found themselves agreeing and also abstaining of opinions. And so by using that integrated response framework, it serves as a legal basis. So it will tell policymakers, it will tell decision makers on the strategic level when and how to respond after cyber incidents or cyber attacks of whatever nature. That is when to use international law and how to use it from a legal basis point of view. So comparative jus ad bellum. Going down to the tactical and operational sphere, the manual will tell you what the issues are when you use operations, when you launch and plan operations, and what the difficulties are for the legal advisor, but also for commanders or those planning those operations or the responses to them, what should be taken into account. Compared with a targeting cycle with a number of legal questions alongside the operational questions. So that's summing up, there's 3 reasons why it's of use. First of all, it serves a constitutional tasker to the government to promote international law. Secondly, it helps top government officials and decision makers in their decision-making process if they have a need to respond to cyber incidents or if they are thinking of launching operations themselves. And then number 3 is on the tactical level or the operational level, those planning and executing operations, how to do that. How is that done? What is collateral damage in the digital realm?
Right. So, Mike.
Yeah, I thought your question was an important one. And the question is, why is this relatively successful? Because it isn't the first contemporary manual. And I've been involved in a lot of the manuals that have been developed. Like, for example, I was one of the drafters of Harvard's Air and Missile Warfare Manual, which immediately preceded the launch of the Tallinn Manual project. And I was in the ICRC's direct participation in hostilities project. And I was one of the authors of the San Remo Manual on non-international armed conflict. But the Tallinn Manual was different. And it was different because all of those previous, including the San Remo Manual, which I did not participate in, on naval warfare, naval operations, all of those only came to a single conclusion. This is the law. We're trying to do a restatement of law and this is the law. When we started the Tallinn Manual project, the very first Tallinn Manual project, way back in 2009, we understood that that was simply not going to work. It was not going to work because no one had written on, I mean, there were a few articles out there, but really no one had written, no one had been thinking about it. The reason we started thinking about it was because of what happened in 2007 in this country, and then the exchange of cyber hostilities and the Georgia-Russia conflict, but no one had been thinking about it. We knew it was new. Moreover, we didn't really understand the technology, to be frank, and so we were uncomfortable applying the law to the technology that we didn't quite get. I mean, I see a naval officer in the audience. I'm a graduate of the Naval War College. And when people started, in the very beginning, people started talking about submarine cables, I thought submarine cables were something your sub comes up and they plug a cable in and now you have communications. You know, so, and I mean, that was the level of understanding in the international law community, because people like me and Paul, we were thinking about counterterrorism, we were thinking about black sites, interrogation, kinetic operations during an armed conflict. So we made the decision early on, and it was the decision that I think led in great part to the success, that we would not purport to necessarily know the answer, but rather we would commit to reflecting in the manual every reasonable view. Now, you know the manual as good as anyone else. We did decide that we would take, and Paul was one of our experts, we did decide that we would reflect majority views among the international group of experts, minority views, and whenever you see few, that means 1 or 2 or 3. And if a state had expressed a view, but none of us shared that view, for example, one state has a view that sovereignty may be breached by non-state actors, nevertheless, we would reflect that view as we acknowledge the existence of a view. And so when it came out to states, when they started using this manual, in most cases, they could find a view that was explained, here's the rationale for the view, that was consistent with their own national interest. And so it was very much less a threat, and has someone who's been involved in the project from the beginning. Whenever I hear someone say, I don't agree with the Tallinn manual, it's like, dude, I don't agree with what? I mean, which rule are you talking about? Because the rules required unanimity, consensus, and they're very broad, very, very broad. What is it you don't agree with respect to the application? Is your view not reflected? And in fact, there are very few views that have been adopted by states that are not reflected. The most significant being the United Kingdom's view that there is no such thing as a rule of sovereignty. But as you know, every other state that's spoken directly to the issue says, no, you're wrong. Of course there's a rule.
Okay,
so the success was the lack of threat. We weren't forcing, because Johanna's right. When it first started coming out, the people in the US DOD were freaked out. Oh my God, we got a bunch of academics that don't even know what a submarine cable is, and they're going to start writing this, and we're going to be forced to respond to the Tallinn manual, but they never were.
So that's an excellent point, right? So the issue is what exactly provokes either state endorsement of a project like this one, or an allergic reaction by a state to a project like this one. And if we look at, for example, Jelena is here, if we look at what the ICRC has done, with similar projects in the past, the one project that has probably been by far the most successful is the customary law study, the customary IHL study, which has similarities, not necessarily in this attempt to reflect every position that's out there, but in this kind of general framing, and the idea that there's this whole body of state practice that is verifiable and that people can check as a source of the rules, even though nobody checks. So if you look at how it's actually being used in practice, people cite rules, they don't look at the practice. It is the idea that there is something to check that works rather than the actual operational reality of it. So let's now then move to the question of why we think some states love it and some states maybe don't hate it, but certainly don't love it. One state that has resisted sort of the manual's influence, but has also resisted similar projects historically, has been the United States. So let's talk a bit about that. in a completely non-controversial way. Why do we think there is this kind of inherent resistance to an effort like this one by the United States? So, Mike, you're American, so you're going to speak second. Johanna, do you want to say something about this?
Look, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think there is the fact that the US is perhaps one of the most mature countries in thinking about the application of international law to cyber. Maybe not necessarily publicly, it hasn't, although the GGE positions are now out and there are several seminal speeches that have been made. And there is a hesitancy as countries are formulating their positions. The US wants countries to formulate their positions, right? And so there is a hesitancy for other projects which put a whole bunch of positions on the table. But I think that is also reflective of the fact that if that is the case, then the US needs to be much more public about their positions in the first place, and also the rationale for their positions. So, you know, I think there's that. I think also and Mike, you're being very self-deprecating, but the point about submarine cables and understanding the technology, there is always in this space when you engage a element of condescension if you are from the outside engaging with people who work and operate on the inside. You can't possibly understand what it is actually like, what we are actually doing, what we are actually confronting. And that's in part why yesterday I was talking about transparency, because I think if you want to have sensible conversations, we need to actually understand more what is going on. But then there is also an obligation for states who are doing this to engage with groups of experts who may have security clearances to drive sensitive conversations and inform those conversations. Again, that really is a transparency point. I think the point that Mike was making about the Tallinn Manual not necessarily representing definitive, this is the answer, is definitely the key to its popularity. Because every country in the world, and I really can say that, I think I've probably spoken to representatives from almost every country in the world, is grappling with how do we respond to regulation of technologies? How does international law apply? And so every country is looking for answers, but every country has different national circumstances. Every country brings a different legal tradition to it. And so being able to have something that isn't presenting the answer, but allows them to look and understand what other people, other countries more specifically, are thinking about these things, goes to that point of it allows countries to formulate their independent view. We're not dictating a view, we're saying these are the positions that exist. And I think that formulate an independent view, certainly we've done capacity building, which I think we'll talk about later, but that is very much why the Tallinn Manual has been something particularly that smaller and medium-sized states, I think, value a lot.
And then, of course, for smaller countries, even though the manual is not super prescriptive, it nonetheless provides them on a platter a menu of options they can choose from, sometimes framed in a particular conceptual way, you know, like the rule of sovereignty. You know, there's a territorial effects or there's usurpation of inherently governmental function that is not intrinsically right or wrong, if you see what I mean, but was devised by the experts and suddenly gets validated and adopted by states because it sounds reasonable to them. And in that sense, if you're a small country, you don't have a big legal department. It's just easy. Yeah. We like this.
Yeah, but you can also see why, so sovereignty, a country like the UK might go, oh, I don't really like the idea of a Tallinn Manual 3.0 writing about sovereignty and pointing out that we're the only country that says it's not a rule. And it's a factual statement, right? And this, again, I don't think that is a downside. I think it's a positive because it requires the UK then to step up and say, well, this is, again, to justify their position and to articulate it. And who knows, maybe they will be so eloquent in their articulation that Tallinn Manual 4.0 reflects a different direction. But you can, you can understand why countries might sort of go, oh, that's a bit uncomfortable.
I mean, I will say on the UK thing, this is an important point because, of course, they have taken this view. They're very much an island in fact and in law, but we're committed. If there's any question whether or not the UK position will be presented as a reasonable question or a reasonable position, let me assure you, it will be there, and in all likelihood, either Marko or I will go down to FCDO or to the MOD and say, this is your position. We want to make sure we get it right. So is this a fair reflection? We did this in Tallinn too with the US. The United States has a very strange position where they believe that the threshold for a violation of the use of force under the UN Charter, Article 2.4, happens to be the same as the threshold for an armed attack that triggers the right of self-defense under Article 51. Now, I think that's simply wrong. I've written many times that I don't agree with the US position. However, when we were writing the manual, I went to someone at State and said, listen, I know this is your position. We're committed to reflecting all views in a fair way. And that person, she actually wrote the paragraph that you see in the manual. And so, we're committed to not telling states they're wrong, but rather reflecting their views and then simply giving a sense of where the experts are.
Can I ask a question on that? So what are the mechanisms for states to provide input into Tallinn 3.0?
Yeah, this is very good. It's an important question.
Sorry, Marko.
So everyone in this room can go online to the CCD COE website and you can make suggestions for alterations. Because we're trying to crowdsource, and that includes governments. Not many people have done that, so I encourage everyone to do that.
Governments like to feel special.
What's that?
They like to feel special.
That is true. We know that.
Yeah. So there is that, and it's, by the way, it's a non-attribution, so we're not going to say we have this recommendation. It was by Yelena. The second way, there is a formal way, and we did it during Tallinn 2, and we probably will do it with Tallinn 3 and even more robust, and that's the state engagement process. We haven't talked about process yet, but near the end, we will have drafts of all the chapters ready to go, and we will look for a state sponsor. Last time it was the Netherlands, hence the term some of you have heard of the Hague process. The Netherlands, the MFA graciously convened states. By the way, the Tallinn Manual people had nothing to do with it. It was all done by the Netherlands to bring states in. They came once. States found it very valuable, so the Netherlands arranged 2 more meetings. The P5 appeared every single time. Australia was there every single time. They commented on our drafts. We had a few experts there so we could discuss the comments. And by the way, there were a lot of people. The Russians sent 3, the Chinese had a delegation, I think, of 5, and so forth. And then we allowed them to also provide written comments. And that was actually a shock because we got, and I'm not exaggerating, we got thousands of comments. Because what we did was we said, here's the draft. Do the little, it's a Word doc, do little balloons. And so Lise and I spent weeks and weeks. What's that?
Be careful what you wish for.
Be careful what you wish for. But many of them were very, very good. Canada, spectacular. Literally, we think this word is better than that word. This is why. And so states will be allowed to do that. When I say it's more robust, we will be looking for states to sponsor that. And in my perfect universe, we'll be doing that on a regional basis. So I don't know, I'm just making this up. Maybe Australia would host something in the ASEAN region or the Indo-Pacific, and maybe the Netherlands will agree to host again, and they will do so for Europe, Eurasia, and maybe Canada will do it for the Americas. So we'd like to do regional, because what we found in the capacity building program that your country and you personally are involved with, or were involved with, is that regions tend to think alike. So it's really valuable to get a bunch of folks from south of the border, if you will, together in a room because they have common interests, common perspectives. They know each other, so they're comfortable. So hopefully there's that. Additionally, if a state or an organization wishes to contact us in advance, because some states, and Canada is a real good example. Canada, they were super engaged, and if Canada wanted to provide comments on Tallinn too, since we're revising that, so they've already got the draft we're revising, but for the chapters, then they can reach out to myself or Marko or Lise and either provide written comments. I've already got some, or in some cases, Marko or I or Lise will fly down and meet with their legal advisors, and so we can have a talk. All of that, all state engagement is absolute non-attribution. The only time we attribute to a state is when a state has made a formal statement. So in the case of Australia, your international engagement strategy annex, that will be cited. But nothing that I discuss, for example, with you in the day or with Toby, would ever make it into the manual has the position of Australia.
It's interesting to see in parallel these official attempts by states to shape opinio juris and the development of the law through, for example, these statements, and this academic project sort of coexisting in parallel. And, you know, the whole idea of some states resisting or not liking a project like this one really makes no sense if they're not making their positions publicly known. If there's nothing to rival the manual, as there was nothing to rival the manual, how can you sort of object to the idea of developing and applying international law to this, right?
Well, I have an answer to that.
It will be difficult. Do it.
Because I've asked that question. You know, early, the Americans were really opposed early on. And it's, why are you so opposed? I mean, I've worked for the Department of Defense for 4 decades, not 4 years, 4 decades. I've worked for the Department of Defense. It's like, I'm not a bad guy, you know? Why are you so nervous? And there are reasons, they're getting ahead of us, but a number of people have said to me, it's because we value ambiguity in this space.
Yes.
We value ambiguity. Clarity is not good because, especially since we don't know the way the technology is going, we don't know what our national...
And this project, by its very definition, is trying to limit ambiguity.
Absolutely
Whatever
right.
it does,
absolutely
it's
right. So you wonder why some states have not produced statements, or they've not produced robust statements, or they've produced a statement that puppets the rule, but without any rationale or without discussing what the thresholds are, because they value ambiguity.
Good.
And it's interesting, some states are exactly the opposite. Some states say, no, we need clarity. And if you're looking at which states they are...
If you're at the receiving end of cyber operations.
Are you a target or are you an operator? Are you offensive or defensive? That drives the perspective a lot. The problem is and I've told very close friends this, the problem with your ambiguity argument is ambiguity is dangerous. Okay, it's dangerous because if you're facing a bad actor, Russia. I mean, we've just had a session on Russia. If you're facing Russia, listen, they have really good lawyers out in Russia, really good ones. And what the Russians do in cyberspace and more generally in armed conflict, because I'm an IHL guy, so experts will probably agree with me. What the Russians do is they find the gray zone. They look for the gray zone, and that's the zone in which they operate. So the classic example is election interference. If you look what the Russians did in the American elections, a very study, they did nothing that would crystal clear be intervention in the internal affairs of the United States or be a crystal clear violation of sovereignty, at least for those states that agree it's sovereignty, like changing election returns or like manipulating election machinery, making it not work at all. No, they operated in that sweet spot that made it hard for the United States to name and shame them for a violation of international law and a specific rule, and B, consider the option of countermeasures. Because many states, Netherlands would be a really good example. Netherlands is a state that is focused on international law in a huge way, and they're going to be very, very, very cautious in their response not to do anything that might be styled as a violation of international law.
So Paul, let me get to you now, and let's move to a sort of big picture question of Tallinn 3.
Yeah.
If we take the premise that less ambiguity is a good thing, and that clarifying international law as it applies to cyber is a good thing, which probably most people in this room would, what would you like to see in Tallinn 3 that's not in Tallinn 2? So what would be your suggestions to us, for example, on, either the flaws in the existing manual or the gaps in the existing manual that you think need filling?
What I would like to see, and to add to the point of departure that states make international law, is there's other bodies that also contribute to international law, and I'm referring to tribunals and courts. So what I expect to see, and it remains to be seen whether that will happen or not, is there will be cases brought to courts related to the issues mentioned and addressed in the Tallinn manual. And the jurisprudence coming from that will be relevant, because it will give us direction whether the international group of experts on its own had a fair view of what the law was, or what we thought the law was at the time, or whether that has changed, or whether we were wrong, whether the rules, the black letter rules should be amended, or in the discussion part, it should be added with other views supplementary to those that are already there. That is one thing. So I expect case law to come forward, not in the direct meaning only, but also by looking at indictments, looking at state practice, so sanction regimes, for instance, looking at the EU cyber diplomacy toolbox and how that is applied, when is it applied, why is it applied. How is that done, and what does it mean for the rules and the discussion and the other views expressed in the manual? And what I'm quite interesting, what will be quite interesting, and then going back to yesterday's presentation by Commander of US Cyber Command and the NSA, was his reference to hunt forward and persistent engagement. And that strategy exercised by the United States has a clear impact on international law. And I'm pretty anxious to learn how that strategy is perceived by those states that are impacted by the strategy and its application. I don't know whether it will surface, I don't know. But it might. It might just surface one way or the other.
So your point about the case law, if I may come back to it, there is one branch of international law where there is more and more case law, essentially by the daily basis, and that's human rights law.
Yes, that's the final thing.
And we definitely want to develop the human rights portion of the manual.
Yeah.
Now, the one problem here, and it's a major problem, is that if you look at how case law, for example, on online speech or online privacy looks like today, 99% of it comes from the European Court of Human Rights. So the Inter-American Court, the African Court, even the UN treaty bodies, they haven't yet had the cases for various reasons. It takes a long time to litigate something domestically and then to get it to one of these international jurisdictions to litigate it through that. And so we will capture that case law, but we run the risk of having a massive European bias to it.
Yeah.
And we will have to find a way to avoid that somehow.
Yeah.
Well, the trick, I think you're exactly right, because an American would say, oh, that's nice.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
And along with the other problems of human rights, extraterritoriality, if you agree that the obligation is extraterritorial, what does that mean? You've written the book on that subject. But with regard to the case law from the European Court, I think one of the things that can do is treat it as a view. So if you swear on a stack of Bibles in front of 10 bishops that you're going to express all reasonable views, then you must express that view, but you need only express it as a view, and then look for alternatives to that view as well and present them.
Yes.
But you're right. You're right. And that is, by the way, that was a criticism of the first manual. It's a criticism of all the manuals. But the first one in particular was seen as, I remember when the first one came out in 2013, in Brussels, there was a flail-X because everyone was interpreting that as NATO doctrine. And of course, NATO, it wasn't NATO doctrine. It was 20 people that happened to be at a center. At that time, wasn't even called the NATO CCDCOE. It was called the CCDCOE. The term NATO came later. And so there was great criticism that this was the view of NATO. And so there was an effort made to diversify the experts. And so we had a Chinese scholar, someone from Belarus.
So there's the issue of actual bias, and then there's the apparent bias. And both undermine the authority and persuasiveness of the manual. So Johanna, what would your views be on this, and how to sort of avoid these pitfalls?
So I will come to that, but I actually want to come back to this point about ambiguity, because I think it's an important point. And the idea that strategic ambiguity is a benefit for us, and by this I mean NATO countries, Five Eyes partners, etc., I think is an outdated concept. If you look back at the evolution of international law in this space, or even look back at the evolution of UN discussions in this space, it was the Russians who initiated these conversations because they wanted to constrain us, because they saw us advancing in terms of technological capability, and they were worried. And they wanted, they've been championing a treaty because they initially wanted to be constraining us. I think we need to face the reality that the tables have turned. And actually, we need to constrain them. And so I just don't think the argument of strategic ambiguity stands any longer. And I think the idea that we will agree rules that Russia and China won't stand up, won't agree or abide by, I think we actually need to interrogate that. I don't know that the evidence supports that. If you look at what Russia is doing in terms of provocation, absolutely, they have violated international law by invading Ukraine, right? They've shown a disregard. But in terms of provoking NATO, they are dancing right up to your lines, and they're not crossing them. And that is a strategic decision that they are making because they have decided that they will take Ukraine, but they don't want to take on NATO. So this idea that we will be constrained and they won't, I don't know that it stands. And you look at China, in the context of China, China actually cares about its international reputation and how it is perceived, particularly if we end up in situations where cases are being litigated and the very excellent panel that we had just before on the conflict in Ukraine and the references there to the preparations that are already being made with respect to ICC cases. Again, it's easy to dismiss this because it doesn't necessarily prevent things happening, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a very real impact on the behaviour of states. And so I really would, I know it's a controversial position, but I really would challenge everyone from government in this room to really have a think about whether that position of strategic ambiguity actually still stands, because I don't think it does. And I say this as someone who has been on the inside, who has extensive engagement with all of the agencies who do this stuff. This is not a position of naive idealism.
One problem, isn't it, with this regard, is that when we speak of governments having a view or states having a view, it is actually multiple different individuals and agencies within these states that have views. Sometimes they're diverging, and the state really cannot agree on a single view.
I think, not even that, I don't think you would find any state in NATO or the Five Eyes who doesn't have fierce disagreements among interagencies on these issues, without question.
And to the extent you're able to say this, how do you think these disagreements map out on, say, foreign ministries versus cyber agencies versus defense people?
You go easy.
Just be gentle. Again, totally non-controversial.
I dare to answer. If let's look at intelligence agencies, intelligence and security agencies, the MOD, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But even within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there's different views. There's the Human Rights Department, and there's the National Security related department, and there's the political department, and the legal department. So even within the MFA, there's already divergent views. I would say that initially, the MOD is willing to find some leeway to be able to conduct operations within the law. But the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would be the one looking at international relations and so on, and would mitigate that view. Let's put it like that.
I think there's also, what I've encountered, what Paul said, 100% on every country I've worked with. I think there's also, since the audience consists of a lot of lawyers, within government, there's a lot of difference of opinion on what the role of the government attorney is, the one providing legal advice. And, since I come from a military background, there are those who believe that their job is to tell the commander why he or she can do something. And then there's the other, in other words, the commander is my client. So what do you want to do, boss? Okay, I think I can get you there. And then there are attorneys who believe themselves to be legal advisors. My job, and I will tell you, I'm in this camp, my job is to give you an objective assessment of the law so you can assess legal risks. If it's a gray area, I want to tell you it's gray so that you can say, what's the blowback going to be and what's the lawfare effect of this particular operation? So when I work with military organizations in my country or other countries, I see this really playing out. The people that want to tell their boss, yes, they love ambiguity. And the others, they want to give their boss the best legal advice, and the more clarity there is, the better able they are.
And this will really vary depending on national legal culture and institutional culture to a great extent. Johanna?
So I think a lot of this was what I was pointing to in my speech yesterday, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but there's 2 points I would make. One is that the fact that we now have military commanders standing on a stage talking about defending the international rules-based order, I think is a signal that the tensions that exist naturally between foreign ministries and defence ministries and the armed forces as distinct from the defence ministries is starting to come together, that we are actually starting to pull together for the same thing. So that I will be very interested to see how that impacts the legal debate. And then to your point about the distinction between foreign ministries, defence ministries, intelligence agencies, this really goes to the argument I was making yesterday about being distinct in what we're describing and talking about. Intelligence agencies are intelligence agencies. Spies are going to spy. They are going to do what they do, and they're not going to be public about it. And we don't want them to, right? They're an intelligence agency. But the operations that are being conducted by defence forces and military cyber operations in support of military operations is an entirely different kettle of fish. And in my experience, when you're talking with defence folks, and particularly people in uniform, the conversation around things like the application of IHL, etc., becomes actually a really interesting, in-depth conversation. The challenge, of course, is that a lot of the activity that we're looking to constrain behaviour for doesn't happen within the IHL realm. It happens below the threshold because they're dancing right up to it. And this is why, people keep talking about the grey zone activities, Russia, China, all of this activity that is happening in this space. Why does it keep happening? In my view, that's in part because we're allowing the ambiguity to perpetuate. We're not actually saying this is unacceptable, and if you cross this line, there will be consequences. Now, I know that those of you who are operators in the room will say, well, we also do stuff, and we don't want to be constrained. And that's where having a skillful, informed conversation with your lawyers comes in really handy. And so I actually am hopeful that the shift that we have seen in the way that these issues are being spoken about, and if there is, one positive that can come out of the horrendous situation in Ukraine. It is that hopefully people will be more rallying behind the idea that the existing rules-based order is something that we all need to fight to be upholding, and I think this is part of it.
And it's also interesting to look at the issue of constraint when you simply don't have that us versus them dynamics.
Yeah.
When you have rules of international law that protect, for example, individual interests or community interests. So if we're going to discuss human rights in the Tallinn Manual, it's normally the state, what can the state do to its own people?
Yeah.
You know, on online censorship, mass surveillance of its own population, not necessarily the population of other states.
Yeah. And just on that us versus them triviality, I would say that part of the shift in the public conversation for me gives me hope that we move beyond us versus them domestically among agencies having these fights to us versus our adversaries.
The actual them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I hope that drives that conversation.
Good. I think this is a very nice point to end our chat temporarily and to open it up for questions. So I hope you know this inspired you to think about the Tallinn Manual 2.0, 3.0, whatever 0.0. And we are very much looking forward to questions from the floor. I see a hand there.
Thank you very much. Is it working? Yeah. Peter Pijpers. I work at the Netherlands Defense Academy with Professor Ducheine. Mike, question to you, but maybe also to Johanna. Well, thanks for all the work on the Tallinn Manual. I use it a lot in all the research. One of the ambitions of the manual was, look, here's the manual. We all agree that international law applies to cyberspace, but how does it apply? So states, come up with your legal opinion. Show us some state behavior. We are now a decade later, years later. Now we have a lot of these legal opinion of states. I don't know if that is a blessing, because a lot of these legal opinions, they diverge. We have states that express their opinion, some are not. You mentioned them. Related to sovereignty, some see it as a primary rule and a principle, some as a principle. You mentioned that. Within sovereignty, when you see it as a primary rule...
there needs to be a question mark.
Yes, at the end it will. Yeah, I'll get it. In sovereignty, there are different interpretations of the rule of... So basically, you have a paradox. You ask for legal opinions, then you get the legal opinions, and then they diverge. So how will you deal with that in the Tallinn Manual 3?
Excellent, thank you.
So be careful what you wish for, I guess, is the question. So I'm not so sure it is a problem. The fact that the states have not explained their rationale behind the view and so forth, I'm not so sure it's a problem, because first we can ask the states, what's your rationale? I mean, you know, the Israelis, in my field, IHL, the Israelis have limited the notion of attack to a cyber operation that causes physical destruction or injury. You know, you're an expert in this field as well. I intend to ask Roy Schorndorf, the Deputy Attorney General. So, like, Roy, that sounds crazy to me. So, what's your respectfully? But so, what's the legal basis for that? Because I'm going to reflect the view in the manual, and I want to make sure I capture that view. The other thing is I mean, you know, life is a journey of small steps, and I don't expect Tallinn Manual 3.0 to be the final version. Marko will do 4.0, and I will be in retirement in the south of France.
I've heard that before.
So I'm not concerned that, for example, taking sovereignty as an example, that I can only say that there are two views, and it seems that the weight of state opinion is in favor of the second view, but the United Kingdom takes this view, and here is the view, and so forth. Because I'm not trying to answer the questions for states. I want to give states the material from which they can do the legal analysis themselves to decide what view, what approach is in their own national interest. And we mentioned the capacity building. When Australia and my friend Johanna asked us to go out and do capacity building, they were adamant, the Australians were adamant that we're not supposed to pitch a particular view, but rather we are supposed to express all the views that are available, and that it is up to states. And we've said many times to an audience in ASEAN or somewhere else that the decision on which of these is the appropriate view is yours. So I'm not horribly concerned, because that's not what we're trying to accomplish with the Tallinn Manual. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited that you asked this question, because I have an answer that my lawyers, when I was working for government, told me I wasn't allowed to say publicly, and now I don't work for government, so I can say it, which is that if you get a bunch of lawyers in the room, which we do probably have here, and asked them to formulate one single position on sovereignty, just sovereignty, not sovereignty in cyberspace, you wouldn't be able to do it. Right? Because countries have different positions on sovereignty. And so we're setting ourselves a bar, in my opinion, that is too high, and it's that old trap of just because it's cyber, we have to do it different. And I don't think we do. What we need is clarity, because if you zoom right out, what is the point of international law? The point of international law is to allow states to coexist peacefully. And what allows you to do that is to understand where other countries' lines are. So the important thing is for us to understand, not for us to agree with what Russia and China's position on the application of IHL is. It's great that we now agree that it does apply, but it's for us to understand what Russia and China's position on how it applies, so that we can provide the advice to those who are making the decisions, so that when we are making a decision about whether or not we are going to cross that line, we actually know where the line is. And at the moment, we don't really know where those lines are. And again, that comes back to the point of, is ambiguity actually in our interests in this any longer? So I really think the idea, and in part I think that's driven by the GGE processes, right? We spend all of this time trying to agree common positions. But I think the important thing at a global level is to agree that bodies of law apply. And then the idea that we're all going to have a harmonized position, I think, is a little bit of a fantasy.
And is not necessary for the body of law to actually achieve its main purpose. Yeah. So a question here and there. Oh,
and there's one at the back as well.
Oh, there's two more. Excellent. It's a
just very briefly, probably to Marko and Mike as the general editors. And to move the conversation away from law just for a moment and towards the tech side, one of the reasons I think Tallinn Manual 3.0 is needed, not least because of the flurry of cybersecurity statements that Mike identified, but also since 2017, the tech has developed so rapidly. And I think COVID has ushered in a lot of changes and transformations there, particularly in the types of malicious activities that we see. So I've got no doubt that the group of experts has got the international law covered for Tallinn Manual 3. My question would be, the examples that we see in Tallinn Manual 1 and Tallinn Manual 2, and that those manuals have become quite famous for the next Tallinn Manual, for Tallinn Manual 3, I think those examples need to be deepened, to be complexified, and there needs to be a lot of techie influence on the way those examples are crafted. So my question is, how are you going to cater for that in Tallinn Manual 3.0?
Cool. You go ahead.
Because you've got the lawyers, right? I mean, you've got a great group of international lawyers, but what about the tech side?
Well, I mean, what we're going to do is exactly what we did the last time and the time before that. We don't do anything without techies. We lovingly call wireheads. The wireheads, and I don't know if he's in the room. Bernhard Bloomberg, anyways, was our wirehead. Yeah. He was great. He read every word many, many times. And he was great because he was the kind of techie that could explain things to the lawyers in ways that we could kind of understand. No, Mike, a submarine cable doesn't have to do with a boat. And so we will not do anything without having a tech scrub. And it's the responsibility of our technical advisor to ensure that we're using the right examples in the right way. And I will tell you, sometimes, we call him Mountain Flower, Bloomberg, sometimes Mountain Flower would come up with either a hypothetical example or a real-world example. a hypothetical example or a real-world example, and then we would have to say, no, that's not reflective of the legal concept. We haven't been clear. But I think your point's well taken. I don't expect many of the examples to survive. I expect a technical team. Of course, you know the the CCDCOE has a technical branch. They'll be helpful, and we'll also have a tech advisor.
If I may just add one thing, though, sometimes it's not the how it's done, but the effects of what's done that legally is the most relevant thing. So I'm not saying the tech is not important, don't get me wrong, but sometimes the exact way of doing it is immaterial legally. And so I think a lot of the manual stands the test of time in that sense. Johanna.
And the point I wanted to make is reinforces that perfectly, which is the tech has changed a lot since Tallinn 2.0, but the tech is always changing. And so if we tie ourselves up in knots to be tech specific, we're actually it will be counterproductive. So yes, we need those examples that demonstrate the application, case studies, etc. But I am a very, very strong advocate for keeping international law in this space technology neutral, because it really doesn't matter what the tech tool is that you are using to breach IHL, for example. No, when you're looking at the principle level, I really don't think it does. I think it does affect the way that the operation might be carried out, but not in terms of whether or not it's a breach of law. And so we will be forever rewriting what we're doing if we're saying, okay, well, this rule applies to lethal autonomous weapons, and this rule applies to malware, and this rule applies in this circumstance. And I think there is also a risk that you end up having divergent positions that end up making no sense.
We're all in agreement.
But I will give one example.
We are all in agreement. There's more questions.
No, it's a really interesting point Russell makes. I'll do it very quickly, because if you look at Tallinn 1 and Tallinn 2, we did make one change based on technology. And it had to do on can you see what's coming through your pipes? And it was the principle of due diligence, the rule of due diligence. And in Tallinn 1, our tech expert told us, can't see what's coming through your pipes. It's impossible. You have if you can't see what's coming through your pipes, obviously you don't have an obligation of due diligence to ensure blah, 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 blah. Tallinn 2, they said, well, the technology has reached the point where sometimes you can see. So if you can understand what's coming through your pipes, and sometimes you might actually be able to do something about it. Well, this sparked a revision. You'll see we're much more tentative in Tallinn 2 in dismissing the application of the rule of due diligence altogether, because now the technology had changed that forced us to change our rather, definitive statement of law. Sorry.
I'm in agreement. I'm with Russell, but we defined infrastructure in a proper and more detailed way in 2 than it was defined in number 1. And that was and by doing that, we understood in a better way how it worked. And if you come to apply those techniques into operations, it's pretty relevant how it works. So I'm fully in agreement.
We are all, I think, in agreement. That's the basic point. It is the specifics, like when we get to an actual specific example where we might disagree. Right. So, question here. Thank you.
Violent agreement.
Violent. Violent.
I'm curious for your takes on, it seems like this is a very state behavior.
Can you just introduce yourself,
I'm
please?
sorry, Gavin Wild, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm curious for your takes on the degree, how this process can be applicable in a universe in which a lot of the behaviors we're outlining are no longer the specific or exclusive remit of states, in an environment where, whether it's NSO group or Wagner or what have you, where some of these behaviors are now outsourced to where the state, and Russia certainly can say, this is not state activity, but of course it is, and there.
Can I actually handle that? So I mean, the manual already does that pretty reasonably well when it discusses the rules of attribution, the law of state responsibility, and it is a state-centric body of law. And so that I think, that, for example, the issue of a state acting through a proxy non-state actor, the current position of the manual does not really need much improvement. But where that issue really becomes terribly acute is in the human rights sphere, where, for example, online speech and online privacy are actually controlled by corporate entities and only very rarely by states. And you will know, for example, that at the UN level, there's been this whole big business and human rights effort of trying to have companies, not just in tech companies, to internalize human rights law in their own decision making. And we have seen companies do that. So we've, you know, if you look at Facebook decisions on Donald Trump, or I don't know, they're full of human rights law. They use human rights jurisprudence. The issue for us in the manual is how to articulate this kind of softish thing into something that's meant to be an encapsulation of binding law. And the honest answer to you is that we don't yet know how exactly we're going to do that in that one particular sphere, which is incredibly important. But it's a major challenge. So 3 questions here. So let's do it like that.
Marko,
so,
there's also a person sitting at the back here who possibly
there's all
is
the
outside
uniformed
of your
people
view.
there.
Yeah.
Oh,
and they have been diligently raising their hands from the start.
Okay, so what we're gonna do is now we're gonna take we're gonna take 3 questions, then we're gonna take 3 questions more, and then we shall survive or not. So just be question marks.
At the beginning or at the end? Well, thank you. My name is Peter Horváth, and I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Hungary, with no legal background, but at least international law enthusiast. I really enjoyed reading the Tallinn manual, and yeah, just
nerd.
You've read it.
Yeah, got into it.
I've never done that before.
Marko, that's one.
But
did you buy it?
Just the 2 reflections on Johanna's. What Johanna said and the first question. So Johanna, you said that the strategic ambiguity is over. But the first reflection on what you said is that the third example, the third Tallinn manual is actually going to summarize what actually happened after the adoption of the second one, and it's going to summarize the different, sometimes diverging practices adopted by nation states. So my question is the strategic ambiguity really over? Because we are going to, refer to the third Tallinn manual according to our wish when we have an agreement with one, position or whether the other, but it can be different. So is it really over?
Good.
So
no. Let's take 3 questions and then we do, because we're running out of time. Sorry, I'm being paranoid. So two people there.
It was for you all furiously write down.
Thank you very much. My name is Mohammed Ahmed, University of Augsburg, Germany. So when we're talking about cyberspace and international law, it's like when we're talking about old bottles and new wine. So the right question is not to ask how can we put the new wine in the old bottles, but if our new wine will taste well after that, after putting it in the old bottles. So do you think that's the right way to assess cyber attacks in international law, comparing them always to traditional attacks? My second question is, we all have seen different statements of state on how can international law apply to cyberspace. So does that mean we have right now an international law of a national nature in regard to cyberspace?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Juliana Schmitt, Belarusian Cyber Partisans. I want to have a follow-up question on non-state actors. We know that there are hacktivist groups, Ukrainian hacktivist groups, Belarusian hacktivist groups that are not affiliated with the government. They are on the right side. They're doing an important job. And they're doing it for a good cause. Yet, potentially, they operate in a gray zone. And as much as I agree with the opinion that we need to get rid of ambiguity, what will happen with such hacktivist groups?
Interesting. Okay.
Is that during armed conflict you're talking about? When you say they're on the right side, are you talking about the Russia conflict?
Russian conflict,
okay.
and let's say in a Belarusian case,
After the elections.
After the elections, correct. After
so
the
even
elections,
outside
in
of
a specific circumstances where people are oppressed and.
So, for example,
yeah.
cyber partisans in Belarus leaking the documentation of police
Yes.
officers who
that
were
committed
beating and
crimes.
imprisoning people.
Yes, correct. Thank you.
Thank you. So, no. We took
Marko,
three.
We promised them. You promised them.
No, they're next. They're the next round.
We took three, and now you can answer, and then we're going to take another three.
It's good that the general is taking care of the cadets.
Who is the moderator here? Okay?
This is a coup.
I am moderating.
I vote for him as the moderator.
Now, you answered the questions put to you, okay? Jesus Christ, and then we will ask more questions.
He even gave us mints at the start.
I even gave you mints, exactly. Please go ahead. I wish I had some wine. There you go.
So do I.
Shall I do the wine question? The old wine?
Please.
So new wine, old bottles was. If I am to advise a commander or my government, regardless of the technique used, I still have to answer two questions. Can you launch an operation of this kind? Can you use any of your instruments of power, state instruments of power, whether it's diplomatic or economic or military? Can I use it for this cause? And how should it be used? So it boils down very basically to the question, is there a legal basis for legitimate behavior in order to, facilitating the application of the instruments of force? That's question number one, compared with questions of jus ad bellum. And then the second question, for those who are to execute that activity, how should it be done? And whether the technique is old or new and the rules have been clarified by virtue of a manual or not, those questions will still have to be answered. So I fully agree with you, but the problem is the answers will have to be brought forward anyway.
And it's inevitable to compare the new to the old.
Yeah, and sometimes
as
it
a
helps,
lawyer,
and
there's no other way
sometimes
of
it
doing it.
helps, and sometimes it's not very useful at all.
Okay.
So I had it written down in response to the question about non-state actors that one of the things that I would like to see in Tallinn Manual 3.0 is we've seen in the conflict in Ukraine both the private sector playing a bigger role and also volunteers. And I think that's something that would be useful and which existing IHL actually provides answers for. And I will leave Mike to speak to that because he's the expert. And that really goes to Juliana's question as well. On the old bottle, new wine, I think for me it's a question of the labelling on the bottle rather than a new bottle or an old different bottle. And in part that goes back to the idea that if we moved to something new, first of all, what's actually wrong with what we have in terms of the legal system that we have, and the fear that my real fear, having been involved in these negotiations, is if you throw away this bottle, you're not going to get something better. And so I actually think whilst this may not be perfect, we have to make sure that we actually appreciate what we already have and talk about how that applies in the circumstance of cyber or different types of technology. And to the point about ambiguity, I'm not arguing that ambiguity is over. I'm saying that it very clearly isn't over. My point is that the argument that ambiguity is strategically useful for us, I think, is no longer a concept that stands.
Very important point. Mike?
So on the non-state actor, I mean, that actually is my field. And it's weird that you asked that question because during this morning's presentation on the Ukraine, which I found absolutely fascinating, I was writing furiously because I said someone needs to write an article on that. And I was making myself an outline of what that article might look like.
He's probably actually already written it. You're so
It's already finished.
I think the manual handles that pretty well, at least with regard to the conflict. However, we need to update it and enhance the emphasis. There is one, and it's called direct participation in hostilities. And so we need to clarify that, for example, someone may directly participate in hostilities even though they were outside the battle space, things like that. We need to clarify, for example, that if someone is engaging in cyber operations to prevent a violation of international humanitarian law. That is not direct participation in hostilities that would then render them targetable, which is important because the Russians have the capability to target those individuals in Ukraine. The real question is one of what about all those individuals that are outside of Ukraine? And the question isn't their status. The question is neutrality. Because if it's an international armed conflict, we know there are belligerents, one on each side in this case, and we know that other states are probably neutral. I've written recently questioning the neutral status a little bit, but if we call them neutral, the question is, does that neutral state have an obligation to put an end to those activities, because neutral states typically must put an end to the exercise of belligerent rights in neutral territory? I'm not so sure the answer is yes, because there's a doctrine called qualified neutrality, but it's very controversial, and very good scholars have written that it's not a good doctrine. I'm a qualified neutrality person, which means that I believe that states do not have to take action to put an end to the IT Army's operations from their territory. However, my colleague at the Naval War College, writing in West Point's Articles of War blog, spectacular blog, in response to me, because I wrote about it there, Pete Pedroso today had a very good blog saying that that's a breach of neutrality. States need to do something. So in that space, we need to be more granular. The law's good, but we need to be more granular. In the non-armed conflict space, I would just echo exactly what my friend Marko said. You know, international law is a body of law that is, like it or not, it's a body of law that is generally designed to handle the relations between states, and we have rules of state responsibility that address attribution, and you apply those rules, and we do a pretty good job there. The big issue is human rights. Marko comes on, now has the co-editor of the project, and if you don't know Marko Milanovic, he's probably one of the top guys in the world, if not the top guy in the world. Well, I'm just saying that to be nice, because there's an audience. But this is,
otherwise, that's not how he treats.
But in all seriousness, one of the reasons why I brought Marko on, why I asked Marko to do this, is because I felt that our chapter on human rights was weak. It was one of the chapters I was most dissatisfied with. And working with Marko and capacity building and all, I understood how weak it is. And so that's an area where non-state actors are going to have to be addressed.
If I may just add, on that particular point, you are not, if you're a cyber partisan in Belarus and you're fighting against the Lukashenko regime outside armed conflict, international law doesn't apply to you. You're not violating international law in any way by leaking the confidential documents of the Lukashenko regime about how many thousands of people were in the Zhodina prison.
Right.
You know, that there's no violation of international law at all. The issue is if they put you in prison for what you've done, does that violate, for example, the freedom of expression you have under the ICCPR? And the answer is yes, normally. You know,
and I would
that's what the relevance of international law in that type of context.
Very quickly respond to your point, because I think you make a really good point. I'm hoping that in great part it is an exercise in clarifying the law, but you're absolutely right. And you've nailed one of the two areas where we will certainly add ambiguity, and the first is sovereignty, because we did not acknowledge this very strange British view, but we must, because it's our commitment. And second, the other area is due diligence. I will be frank that Australia hasn't come on board yet. In due diligence, I did not expect as much pushback, and it is on the notion of due diligence, and the Five Eyes states as well as Israel have now pushed back on due diligence, and I did not expect as much confusion over the nature of the due diligence principle. So due diligence, which is hugely important, is going to change quite a bit to add in the uncertainty about it and to make it more granular for states that are trying to figure it out what their national position.
Thank you.
Right.
Now, I'm going to make an executive decision. We have 5 more minutes. We're going to steal a couple of more minutes from the break, if that's okay with you, and we're going to go to the people who very patiently waited to ask questions, and we're again going to take a couple of questions, please.
My name is Samantha Gunn. I'm with the United States Military Academy at West Point. And my question to the panel is, how do you define the sovereignty in a cloud computing environment? And does the locality of the servers and or the location of the data on those servers matter?
Thank you. There's one more question there. So just one question there and then there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I hate to, you all such amazing experts, and I hate to burst this consensus or groupthink, whatever you want to call it. You know, I've been composing in my head a response to Professor Libicki's absurd analogy yesterday. I think that, you know, I want to ask you how you would accommodate in terms of the practical arguments of ambiguity with respect to the comments by Finland earlier about their motivations for ambiguity. And secondly, how you accommodate the emergence of doctrine. It's great to have techies, but you have doctrinal expertise. We no longer have that clear line, I think, arguably, speaking for myself, between Intel and cyber. I don't think there is a conflation of cyber and Intel when the paradigm that's emerging is information warfare, which is cyber plus Intel plus information operations plus EW, and for the Air Force plus weather. If you think about it, you'll figure out why. So how you can account for that if it's not just about cyber anymore.
Okay, thank you. And then the final question there, please.
Since you got such short and easy questions earlier, I'll be very brief. Ingrid Winter, I'm the Norwegian Special Envoy at the center here, also an enthusiast more than definitely not a lawyer, to be more precise. And forgive me, a lawyer would probably have asked this question better. But to your point on other institutions contributing to bodies of law and jurisprudence, and Victor Jora's comment during the Ukraine panel this morning, I was wondering if anyone on the panel wanted to predict how what will likely be the first case law in this field coming out of Ukraine in the coming years will impact, for example, Tallinn 3.0. Very simple, straightforward, short question, right?
Okay, good. Who wants to go first?
I'll do the final question. What pops up is there is this debate about blocking RT and Sputnik. That might very well be the first case coming up. So that is in a human rights realm.
Human rights. Yeah.
No, this will be a Court of General Instance and or what the General Court and the CG EU, because it was done in the EU by EU directives. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not in the IHL field, but in another one.
That might be the first one. I mean, it's you know, these cases take so long to.
So my question was, how will that affect Tallinn 3.0 in 5 years' time?
No way to know. No way to know what's gonna. If something comes out, then we'll take it into account. That's the best we can do. Essentially, it's really hard to predict actually what decision will come down when and whether it will have cyber implications. Johanna?
So I'm going to take the middle question about the ambiguity point. I think the point that was being made by Finland was a different point. The ambiguity that she was looking to preserve there is the ambiguity of articulating when you know someone is on your networks or not. And so it's sort of the opposite end of the ambiguity. So what I'm talking about is ambiguity more in where our red lines are, and maybe not even where our red lines are, but where we have sort of a reddish, pinkish border. At the moment, we're not even being clear about that. And so that question of whether or not we know someone is on our networks, I absolutely understand why we're not going to be explicit about that, because if we're articulating every time we know they're on our networks, then that allows people to probe and understand when they're not on your networks and when our capabilities are not distinguishing what we do and don't know. So there's very clear operational reasons then to maintain the ambiguity there. it's also, for me, the point you raise about doctrine is a really important one, and it goes back to the question earlier about tech neutrality or not. I think when you're getting to the doctrinal level, how do you apply this in an operational sense? It makes sense to get into the technology at that level, but that's not necessarily something that needs to happen at the international level immediately. And this is a progressive process that will unfold. And so I think it's a step there. On that final point of distinguishing between intelligence operations, electronic warfare, operations in support of armed conflict, etc., I think the linking of intelligence operations very directly to operations in support of armed conflict is something that we need to really think carefully about. We have in Australia the Australian Signals Directorate, and we have Information Warfare Division within the Australian Defence Force. They operate together sometimes, but they also operate under separate authorities. And there's the old adage, the difference between CNE and CNA is intent, and that obviously still holds. When we're in situations of armed conflict, I think it's a lot clearer. And this, for me, is not saying that we won't have absolute clarity at all times, but I think in the situation of armed conflict, there is benefit in being clear about this.
Thank you. Mike?
I'll address the question on litigation. Because I thought about it this morning during the Ukraine, because one of the participants, I can't remember which one, was talking about all the cases that will be brought against Russia, hopefully, in the ICC, wherever, national courts, because of course there's universal jurisdiction over war crimes and so forth. So I'm not so sure I've seen many war crimes committed by Russia. Now, is Russia targeting civilian infrastructure? You bet. Is there a rule of international humanitarian law and international criminal law that you may not attack civilian objects? Of course there is. So attacking a civilian object is a war crime. But the issue of what is an attack in the cyber context, which we struggled with in the manual, has yet to be settled, and very few states have spoken to this issue. Israel being a notable exception, France being a notable exception. So if I used to be a prosecutor, if I was going to prosecute someone for the war crime of attacking civilian objects, looking at the Russian operations, I'm going to struggle. So
you're talking about cyber. You're not talking about
Cyber.
artillery.
My God, no. I mean, listen, it's a textbook case of every war crime. I work with a team at West.
I just wanted to make this clear that he's not an apologist for Russian war crimes. That's all I just wanted to do.
You forgot the word cyber.
Another reason why you were required, Mark.
Yes, only cyber. I mean, I work with the folks at West Point, and we're having a hard time literally keeping up with the number of war crimes being committed by the Russians. It's really quite extraordinary and horrific. But in the cyber context, I'm going to struggle. The other problem is that the offenses attacking a civilian object, the Russians are engaging against data. The question is data as a matter of law and object? And there's another question that has been yet to be resolved. And I don't see any resolution on the horizon. So I think that's pretty unlikely, just because of making the offense out. To the folks at West Point, well, since I'm affiliated with West Point, what a great question. Although, since I'm also affiliated with the United States Naval War College, where I'm a professor emeritus, I have to admit to the Naval Academy folks that the reason they asked such a good question was because after the last session, I went to them and said, "Are you kidding me? You're going to let the Naval Academy ask a good question and you're not going to respond in kind?" So that's the genesis of this superb question. So it is a wonderful question. I'm not so sure I have the answer for you. So I think I know how to explain the law of sovereignty. If a cyber operation generates particular effects on the territory of another country, then that's a breach of sovereignty. Now, we haven't got consensus on what the threshold of effects is, and we're looking for that now. But I can tell you that's the rule, and I can also tell you that if a cyber operation interferes with inherently governmental function of another country, like holding elections as an example, law enforcement has another example, that's a violation. But of course, cloud computing complicates this. And so what I would say is, since we are struggling to find acceptance of the legal rules of the game with regard to sovereignty already, trying to figure out cloud computing, don't hold your breath. Don't hold your breath. I don't think
the one thing that can certainly be said is that location of the infrastructure does matter.
That's
if you are
the point.
Estonia and you know there's cloud computing infrastructure on your territory, you have the right to regulate whatever you want out of that.
Right.
By and large. I mean, so
it's the rule of jurisdiction, international law rule of jurisdiction. But we actually thought of that question and just left it alone. The manual has a throwaway sentence that says, golly, it's translated into Texan, it's golly, I really can't figure this one out.
Okay, in Texan, we are 5 minutes behind schedule. Thank you so much for attending this panel on the Tallinn Manual. We hope you liked it and that we have your thoughts and prayers with us in the effort.
Good luck.